Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Schimmel at DevOps.com, and thank you for joining us on another DevOps.com webinar. This one sponsored by CloudBees, the Enterprise Jenkins company. We're going to get started in about a minute or so. We'll give some late arriving folks a chance to log in here. So if you can just bear with us. While we're waiting, though, let me quickly go over some of the features of the GoToWebinar panel that hopefully you folks are seeing as you're logged in here. We have set aside some time for questions at the conclusion of today's webinar, and we prefer that questions come in via the questions section of the control panel. And hopefully you're seeing it in there. You could type your questions in. You do not have to wait till the question session to begin to type in your questions. You can put them in at any time, and this way they're stored. You don't have to worry about forgetting what your question was, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. I see we're already getting a few people just kind of logging in and making sure it works. And hello, David Newton. Yes, this does work. And this session is being recorded. I'll get that out of the way. The session is recorded, and the entire recorded session, as well as just the slides, will be available on DevOps.com and via CloudBees in about 24 to 48 hours after the live session. If you registered for the webinar, you'll receive email around that. So questions are open. You can ask your questions at any time, and we will get to them at the end. So we're about 2 minutes in, and I think we're going to get started, though you know what, people are still joining as we speak. But we need to get going, otherwise we won't have enough time for all of your questions, hopefully, that you'll ask. So today's webinar is continuous delivery at cloud scale with the CloudBees Jenkins Platform and Docker. So probably two of the hottest technologies in the market today, in the world, the development and ops world, is both Docker and of course Jenkins. We're very lucky to have with us today Tracy Kennedy. Tracy will be controlling the slides, and Tracy is an associate product manager at CloudBees, and she's going to be giving us slides as well as a hands-on demo of Jenkins and CloudBees with Docker, so you'll be able to see all of that. And here's our agenda for today. Find out a little bit about CloudBees in case some of you may not be familiar. Jenkins, Docker, and then CD with Jenkins workflow and Docker. At the end, we also have another guest joining who may help if you have any more very technical questions. So we hope we've anticipated and we'll be able to satisfy you all. Without further ado, though, let me bring this on to Tracy. Tracy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Alan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. All right, hi everyone. Again, as Alan said, my name is Tracy Kennedy, and I'm an associate product manager at CloudBees. Just to give you guys a little context about who CloudBees is in the first place, before we go into details about how to use Jenkins with Docker, I'm just going to give you guys just a quick overview about CloudBees itself. So CloudBees is considered the Enterprise Jenkins company, and what that means is that we're a company focused around developing solutions for Jenkins and powered by Jenkins, and this comes in the form of something we call the CloudBees Jenkins Platform, and I'll go into a little more about that in the next few slides, but this platform really is providing the backbone to everything that I'll be presenting today, and the whole business value behind CloudBees is really that we're here to provide enterprise level solutions to enable companies to use Jenkins in production for continuous delivery, to deliver better software faster. So with 1 second, there we go. So the big overview then with CloudBees and the CloudBees Jenkins platform is that, again, we're providing enterprise level solutions when it comes to Jenkins. We also provide, underpinning all of that is really our support and services arm. And what that means is that we provide support for both the open source core, the open source plugins, there's over 1,000 of them, as well as, of course, our own features and solutions. And we also offer professional services for new teams onboarding to Jenkins, training for both administrators and users. We also act kind of as stewards to the open source community in that we issue security advisories and fixes. We also manage the open source Jenkins newsletter, which focuses on whatever issues are relevant to the community today. So for example, one hot topic right now is a UI overhaul that some of our engineers are doing in collaboration with the open source community. And for anyone familiar with Jenkins, this is definitely a much anticipated change in how people interact with Jenkins today. But to circle back a little bit and talk a little bit more about the platform, let me just introduce you to some of the main features, especially the ones that we'll be discussing today in relation to Docker and continuous delivery. So when it comes to Jenkins, for anybody who's not familiar, Jenkins is the #1 CI CD server in the market today. It was created around 10 years ago by Kosuke Kawaguchi, who is now the CloudBees CTO. Jenkins itself is highly extensible. There are over 1,000 plugins in the open source community. It has a very active community that regularly contributes new plugins, bug fixes, and then of course there's something called the Jenkins core, the core code, the thing that actually is Jenkins, that all of the new features plug into. And so when it comes to Jenkins though, enterprises have very specific needs that maybe the open source plugins don't necessarily address. And that's where, again, CloudBees comes in. So one such offering that or solution rather, that we present as part of our platform is something called CloudBees Jenkins Operations Center. And this is just a management tool for an organization's entire Jenkins installation. So what that means is basically that any Jenkins masters in an organization can be centrally managed by whoever is the Jenkins administrator. Common maintenance tasks can be automated. The administrator can also enable things like single sign-on between Jenkins masters, role-based access control to hide certain things, prevent certain people from logging into certain masters, even prevent people from seeing entire folders filled with projects. So that's just one aspect of our platform. The other aspect, though, is the whole idea of promoting continuous delivery solutions, one of which is this workflow plugin, which we'll be talking about today and which you'll see in my demo. Workflow itself is a new approach at creating continuous delivery pipelines within Jenkins itself. Previously in Jenkins, Jenkins itself was created again 10 years ago, back before CD was even a thing that people were dreaming about. It was not the golden standard. People just wanted to automate some basic things like automate their tests, automate their builds, and packaging, and have some sort of record of these things, who was kicking these things off. And Jenkins was the perfect solution for that at the time. But it was designed at that period of our development, I guess what's the right word, cycle, I guess. It was designed more around the idea of having these individualized, isolated stages where builds are happening, tests are happening, etc. But there was no real way to really chain them all together and treat the entire pipeline as a first-class object in Jenkins. And that's kind of where workflow comes in. So around mid-June, I guess, of last year, CloudBees started collaborating with the community to create a solution, just the all-in-one box solution for creating pipelines in an easy way, being able to visualize them, having advanced logic be the thing that links different stages in a pipeline rather than having some sort of linear flow, because real life is much more complicated than that. And so that's how workflow came to be. It hit version 1 in November of last year, and the adoption has been through the roof since then. And so the idea is that workflow allows Jenkins developers to create pipelines programmatically. The advantage of this, of course, is that these scripts, these workflow definitions, can be defined in a version control system and loaded into Jenkins. And when you do something like that, load things from version control, another advantage, of course, is that if somebody makes a change, some sort of breaking change, rather than trying to figure out what that was, maybe using the job config history plugin, it's just a matter of going back to the last good commit In this case, in my screenshot, I'm version controlling the file in GitHub, but of course you can use your an on-premise GitHub Enterprise installation or any other Git SVN repository to store your files. And then, of course, the other advantage, again, is that because the script is the workflow script is defined programmatically with a Groovy DSL, you can, again, I'm not displaying it here, but of course you can set logical triggers for things, if-else statements, try-catch, for loops, etc. Anybody with a basic understanding of how to use a script can learn how to use workflow. And another advantage, of course, is that workflow ships with a little script generator to kind of help people who are new to the idea of workflow, new to the idea of Groovy, to help them generate scripts to do what it is that they want to do. Another advantage of workflow is the fact that they're durable. So a common pain is that a large enterprise will often run some sort of build or test that may take hours. I've even heard of one like testing suites that take days to run. And a huge pain is that sometimes the master will go offline for whatever reason, routine maintenance, plugin updates, maybe there's some sort of network problem between the master and the slave running the job. Normally in Jenkins, with the traditional Jenkins job type, this means that the job, the build of that particular job is actually killed if it disconnects from the master and it can't communicate with the master. But the advantage of workflow here is that the workflow doesn't need that connection. As long as the job is being run on a machine that is online, that can, despite any disconnects with the master going offline, restarting, etc., as long as the workflow itself is being executed on a machine that is still online, it will continue to run. And that's kind of what I was trying to show in the screenshot here. As long as, again, the caveat is that it has to be a shell script step that's being run or a batch script. And usually that's the kind of trigger that we're seeing people use to trigger their testing suites. So that was kind of the idea behind that durable build step. And finally, and as again you'll see in today's demo, workflows are really again they can be long. It depends on the enterprise or the user that's creating them. But the idea is that in theory, if you have gone through all of these steps, you want to deploy your artifact finally to, say, Artifactory. In theory, you don't want to have to rebuild all of that. You don't want to have to pull the code again and retest if it fails for some silly reason. Again, let's say Artifactory is down, or maybe there's some sort of network issue. Again, you have durable build steps to help you if the master itself goes down, but you'll need something else to help you in the case where you don't want to have to waste time rebuilding, retesting. Of course, here in this dummy demo, you can see each step ran for 10 seconds, but in real life, unfortunately builds don't run quite that fast. So the idea behind these value adds the CloudBees platform offers for workflow, one is called checkpoints, and checkpoints allows you basically to restart from the last good stage, the last successfully run stage, and then you can reuse any artifacts you've already built, tested, etc., and save yourself the pain of having to rerun that half of your workflow or quarter, etc. The other advantage is something called the workflow stage view. This is, again, a part of the CloudBees Jenkins platform, and what this does, as you'll see today, is it visualizes in real time each run of your particular workflow. So anybody who's used Jenkins before is familiar with the idea of blue balls. In this case, you'll have blue numbers, I guess, to represent the build number. So here, this is run number 8 of my workflow, run number 9, 10, 11, 12, and then each run is represented as a row in this chart. And then each stage in my workflow is represented as a column. So here, again, this is just a dummy little screenshot, but here you have your testing stage, retesting, and a million deploy stages before we clean up the workspace. So again, this is visualized in real time. You can also trigger checkpoints from this particular view, hence the retry button. You can also download artifacts from this view, and that's what this download button is here. And now for the main event, the reason all of you are probably logged in, we're going to talk a bit about how Docker works with the CloudBees Jenkins platform today. These features are relatively new. They were released in June of this year. So of course, if you guys have any suggestions or any new features you'd like to see, please send me an email after this webinar. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about how you're using Docker today or how you would like to use Docker in the future.
Sure. Hey, Tracy, this is Alan.
Yeah.
Before we jump into here, we did prepare a polling question to get an idea of our audience involvement with Docker. So today's, and guys, if you can answer this, it'll help Tracy kind of focus in where we need to focus in talking about Docker. So our quick question is, what's your current level of usage of Docker? Select one of the following. You're currently using it, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in production. You're using it, though, whether it be in a dev environment or a test environment, or you just at this point heard about it but still investigating it. So if you can answer one of the other, and we won't take too long with it. We'll just give it another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So Tracy, I guess as we spoke about earlier, 74%, hold on, close poll, share results. Okay, as you can see, 74% of our listeners, Tracy, are just still investigating Docker, with only 26% actually using it. So very interesting indeed, and with that in mind, we'll let you take it from here.
All right, great. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, that's pretty much in line with the studies I've seen so far about the marketplace and the feedback CloudBees has been getting about Docker. So for the benefit of everyone then, let's go through like an introduction to what Docker is, just to review before we kind of get into what features are available when it comes to Jenkins and Docker. So for the benefit again of everyone, Docker is an open source project. It's a platform for building and shipping applications using containers. This platform is about creating standardized, repeatable environments, and as you can imagine, that's ideal for a lot of use cases. One of which is Jenkins slaves, which we'll talk about today. Another of which is a new type of architecture that's kind of emerging as an industry trend, something called the microservices architecture. I won't talk about that in too much depth because this is not really Jenkins specific, but again, a trend when it comes to Docker is that people are starting to break down how they architect their applications. Instead of having one giant monolithic Java app, they're breaking it out into little tiny services with a single front end. And as far as the user knows, it's still the same monolithic app. But when it comes to the developer and operations side, things are a lot easier because it's easier to deploy, incremental updates to a tiny microservice than it is to a giant monolithic app. And also, things like Docker, they're supported by management platforms. So Docker itself, again, is a containerization technology and platform, but there are other solutions out there today which are also open source around managing those containers, scheduling them, clustering them. One such tool is called Kubernetes. And if anyone has any questions about that, we can discuss it.
Tracy?
Sorry?
Tracy,
yes, Alan?
Tracy, it's Alan again. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
I'm just seeing the polling question. I'm
Oh,
not sure if everyone else is seeing your slides or not. Maybe it's just me.
It says I'm on air.
Yeah. If people, I'm not 100% sure, but we'll ask our Jules engineer to help. I don't want to hold this up too long.
No, that's fine. Let me reshare my screen. Give me 1 second.
Oh, there we go. I think that might have done it. If you could reshare now. There we are.
Can you see my microservice architecture slide?
Yes, but we're seeing your screen manager rather than the screen.
Oh, that's strange. Okay, 1 second.
So I think swap this. There we go. Excellent.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, thanks for the heads up. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Talk that no one can see. All right. So I guess I'll roll back a little bit. So again, basically, the idea was that a lot of people are using Docker in a new way to re-architect their applications in a way that's easier to deliver incremental updates kind of in line with the whole DevOps culture change that we're seeing in the industry today. So the idea is that instead of having one giant monolithic application, you have a suite of small services, each with their own process, maybe each have their own database. They're all running within Docker containers, and they're all hiding behind a single front end. So let's pretend that this is some sort of Amazon clone. In this case, you'd say that maybe this particular service is a shopping cart microservice. This particular service is handling credit card transactions, and maybe this service is handling, wish lists. It's a lot easier to maybe cluster the services that get hit harder. Maybe not many people make wish lists, but a lot of people do credit card transactions. Maybe we'll want to run this in a cluster of 5 or 6. And there are tools that underpin these things, underpin Docker containers, which can allow you to manage them like this. One such tool is Kubernetes. I won't be talking about that much today, but if you guys have questions, I do have some backup slides, and our Q&A expert on the webinar, Uday Arkoti, has some expertise in Kubernetes as well. And so the challenge then, though, is that even though the application that you're delivering, yes, we've broken it down into little tiny pieces and we're delivering them in containers, how are we going to test these things? How are we going to ensure that, yes, this is a standardized environment, but does my application actually work? Are there all the correct dependencies being packaged inside of that Docker container? And the answer there is that Jenkins is now, your one-stop shop for creating a continuous delivery pipeline focused on building Docker images, deploying them as containers into production, your staging, your testing environments, and even acting as the underpinning pieces for your Jenkins architecture. So this is just one such use case. I'll go into a little bit more detail about mine in my demo today, but at a high level, one way that you can use Docker and Jenkins today is to use Docker, again, as a way to deliver your applications and to use Jenkins, specifically Jenkins workflow, to orchestrate that entire build process, that entire deployment process. So just what I'm showing here on my screen today, step one, is that we need something to trigger this pipeline. In this case, it's a change to an upstream Docker image. If any of you, again, have looked or read about Docker before, you'll know that there's something called a Docker registry, and that's where people store their Docker images. One of the popular public ones is something called Docker Hub. I believe it's just registry.docker.hub.com, and of course they also offer an on-premise enterprise version as well. So basically what this particular plugin does, Docker Hub Notifications, is it takes notifications about changes to upstream images. Any image that you've configured your particular workflow to look for. Maybe it's an image that you're packaging your applications in. In today's demo, we'll be using Tomcat, the official Tomcat Docker image. If there's some sort of security fix issued, maybe there's a new JDK packaged with that particular image, you would want to trigger a new job to take those changes into your images. And you would also obviously want to test them first before deploying that into production. So the idea here is, again, Docker Hub is triggering the start of our pipeline, and this new feature, Docker Hub Notifications, is enabling that. So once we get this notification, for example, Tomcat has is updating some sort of library that's packaged within that Tomcat container. Now we need Jenkins to do our rebuild with that new image. So Jenkins will need to pull our code out of source control. This can be Git, this can be TFS, this can be Perforce. It's really up to you what your organization's needs are. But Jenkins can also pull, again, any dependent Docker images. Maybe that's a slave image. That's an image that you're going to use to create a Jenkins slave rather than have a static resource for that. And you'll run your entire build within that slave container. Maybe that's some sort of other downstream Docker image that takes this upstream Tomcat image as a dependency. In any case, Jenkins will take in all of these things. Jenkins workflow, again, will orchestrate all of this. Your entire pipeline will be defined as a workflow Groovy script. Jenkins can then do the usual things, create the container, package your application into that container, run it, do any tasks that you've scripted out that you'd like to run against that container. Maybe you're testing to make sure the right binaries are available. Maybe you have some sort of Selenium testing that you want to run to make sure the user interface works. In any case, once you've run your testing, then you can deploy your container to your staging environment if you have one, and finally production. And this last piece here, number 3, Docker traceability, is really about the fact that now, the trend now is that people want to be accountable. Developers are supposed to be accountable as part of the whole DevOps culture change in whatever changes they make. So once this container goes into production, it's not supposed to just go over the wall and no one sees it again. The developer needs to know that it made it there, that it's working. He can rest easy and work on the next big thing that he needs to work on. And so the whole idea of Docker traceability is that once this container is deployed into production, it will report back to Jenkins, where I am, what version of the application do I have packaged here, am I working fine, yes, no, etc. And that's another plugin that is called Docker traceability that enables this particular use case with Jenkins. A couple of other use cases that I won't be covering today because this is not a 5-hour webinar. One particular one is, again, I mentioned it before, but using Docker to create containerized, customized slaves, and especially slaves that can be shared. So again, for all the Docker newbies out there, one way that you can create a Docker container is to create a Docker image. You can either create that by pulling a container or pulling an image from Docker Hub, for example, running it as a container, making your own changes and committing that, or you can create a file with a set of dependencies, etc., and this file is called your Docker file. This is where you're defining what needs to be in your environment. Any developer can write it. It's fairly simple to do. There's also plenty of examples out there. So basically the idea is that if you have some sort of specialized build needs in your organization and you want to have some sort of templated Docker-based slave for your Jenkins installation, you can create that as a Docker file. It's rather a matter of just writing down, again, what type of build tools you need available in that environment, and your developer should be able to do that for you. Giving that Docker file to Jenkins so that Jenkins can build it into a Docker image. Again, this is a use case enabled by the new Docker features as part of the CloudBees Jenkins platform. So again, we're giving Jenkins our Docker file. He's creating an image. This image can create multiple containers. Maybe you only need one. And you can also publish this image to Docker Hub. Or again, you can just run them. Maybe this is your production environment. Maybe this is your Jenkins slave. And these things can be launched. Multiple containers can be launched from a single image, as long as Jenkins knows where that image is and has access to the right credentials to download it from your registry. The other use case that we won't be covering today is the ability to share those Docker executors between different Jenkins masters. This is a feature specific to the CloudBees Jenkins platform, and it's enabled with the Docker Slaves plugin. And what this does is, again, if you'll remember from earlier with the CloudBees Jenkins Operations Center, that is really the central management tool for an organization's Jenkins instances. So what this tool does is it can allow Jenkins masters to share Docker Cloud configurations. So configurations telling each Jenkins master, this is where my Docker Swarm server is. Here are the credentials to access it. Here are the templates that you should be using. These are the good known tested slave images that we have on file. Please use these. So that's just a way to, again, more efficiently use resources between your Jenkins masters, sharing build resources. Each of these masters can use them on demand and then return them to the pool, kill the executor, etc. Once they're done using them. But again, those are 2 use cases we won't be covering today. Instead, this will be the use case that I'm covering in my demo. In my particular case, I will be using a Docker slave. I have a Docker slave image. I didn't actually create it, Kasuke did. It's called Kasuke/Acme Core-build environment, and it's actually in Docker Hub if you want to try this use case for yourself. I can pass on these links if you guys are interested after the webinar. But what this image is is I'm passing this image's location to Jenkins. I'm telling it it's in Docker Hub. Here are my credentials to access it. And Jenkins will take that information and create a slave container, a Docker container, based on that image. It will have all of this image's dependencies already packaged in there. So all of the build tools I need, in this case just Maven, will be available for that particular slave agent. And then my Jenkins, again, will be orchestrating all of this using the Docker Workflow DSL, using that workflow plugin I discussed earlier. And workflow, again, will be orchestrating all of this. So it will be telling Jenkins to pull the source code. In my case, today it will be coming from GitHub. And I'll also be pulling in an image that I want to package my application into. So this code is going to be built into a WAR file. We're going to package it into my own image, but which will be based off of the official Tomcat image. Once we've tested it, etc., we're going to push that customized image to Docker Hub, and it's our tested image, it's our gold image, and this image will be called Acme Core-app. So without further ado, let me pull up my demo, and here it is. Can you confirm that you can see it, Alan?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, Tracy, I can see it.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. I don't want to be the only one. Fantastic. Thank you, then. All right, then. So, again, this is the CloudBees Jenkins Platform, hence the header right here. And this is a workflow job, which will be, again, running through that entire Docker CD pipeline from pulling the code, creating the Jenkins slave, doing the build, and then pushing it into production, which in this case will just be on my Jenkins master's local host, port 9999. So again, this is the visualization that we have of our workflow. As you can see, my last 4 runs were successful. Each run took about 15 seconds to build, 39 seconds to package it up, and 5 seconds to deploy. And let's go ahead and look at the configuration. Again, one option when it comes to workflow is to have your job, your workflow pipeline be triggered by something. In this case, we can monitor Docker Hub to see if any of these images that my pipeline depends on, if they've changed. Maybe a new slave was created, and maybe I don't want to watch for that. I can exclude that. I can specify exactly which images we should be on the lookout for. If you'll remember, the Tomcat image is the one of special interest because we're packaging our application into a Tomcat container based on that image. Alternatively, just like any other Jenkins job, we can also just run this job on a schedule using cron. We could run it every minute, every hour, or every day at midnight, etc. It's not considered best practice, but for the purposes of this demo, it's totally fine. I'm not really competing with anyone for resources here. And then down here again, this is it. This is the entire definition of our pipeline defined in like 15 lines rather than 5, 10 different Jenkins jobs, each with their own config.xml. And so what we have here, again, this is a Groovy script. I could have just checked this out of an SCM. For the purposes of not switching between different tabs, I've just put the definition here. And here, what we're defining, again, is our entire workflow. So right here, this first step, we're telling Jenkins what node, what slave machine do we want to run this on. In this case, I'm just running it on the master. Again, not a best practice, but fine for a demo. But in your case, or any of you listeners' case, you would want to have some sort of probably dedicated slave machine that could run these Docker jobs that has the Docker CLI installed. So again, I have Docker installed on my master machine, so I'm just going to use my master to run this job. And then here I'm defining something called a stage. A stage, again, it's just a decorative name. Ideally, really, it's for the visualization so that we can see at a high level how long each stage is taking, what's actually happening in each stage, where is each stage being run. In this case, of course, they're all being run on the master, and there's only 3 of them here: build, package, and deploy. And obviously, you'd want these stage names to be somewhat descriptive of what's actually happening and not just something silly. So again, here I have my build stage, my first of 3 stages, and here I'm using the Docker DSL, the workflow Docker DSL, to say I would like to run this entire stage within this particular Docker image. Again, Kasuke/Acme Core-build environment, which is available in Docker Hub. It's in a public repository, so I don't need a credential to access it. Now, what this block does is it's running all the commands that I've specified within this particular Docker slave, this Acme Core build environment. So what I'm doing here is within that Docker container, I'm checking out my code from GitHub. This is Uday's GitHub repository with his Docker Jenkins demo app. And if you'll look here, this is his repository. Again, Uday Docker Jenkins demo app. And here we've defined, he has his Docker file, he has a Jenkins file. This Docker file in particular is just defining a base image that his other slave images are based off of. We're not using that today. And here, though, is the money, the pom.xml. This is what we're going to check out and run our Maven build commands against. And so, again, we're checking this code out of GitHub, and then we're going to run Maven to actually do the build and package up this code as a WAR file, which will then archive into the workspace. From there, I'm just going to connect to, again, Docker Hub, but with credentials, and then I'm going to create, again, this is just a decorative naming, but I'm naming this particular stage package because this is the stage where I'm packaging my WAR file into my company's, or into that Tomcat container, and then pushing it as my company's app, packaged in that container into Docker Hub. And then I'm applying something called a label to that image called demo. By default, the label is latest. You could create something more decorative. When it comes to Tomcat, they have labeled their different images by what's inside. So this is JDK 1.8, etc. So in this case, again, I'm just labeling it demo. And then stage 3, I'm using a shell script that was checked in as part of the Uday's project in GitHub, and I'm using this script to deploy to localhost 9999. And then before we move on, I guess, just to note, since we're already here, this here, I mentioned earlier, this is called the snippet generator. Basically, it allows you to create, or actually creates for you, steps that you can integrate into your workflow to do certain actions. So for everyone who's new to Groovy and is a little intimidated by it, this is really useful. So for example, say we want to do a checkout from Git. If I just gave it my repository URL, any credentials I need to check out from whatever Git repository, it will create the line for me. I didn't really give it a GitHub URL. Let me do that real quick. Actually, this is the right link. If I do that and I click this Generate Groovy button here, it will create the step that I can just copy and paste into my workflow. So the only thing that you would really need to learn as a beginning workflow or a Groovy script writer is the basics of it. It's really just a stripped down version of Java that's more user friendly. So again, hopefully this all makes sense. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A window, and I'll go ahead and just run this really quickly. And so let's build now. Just like any other Jenkins job, I'm not going to push a new image or anything like that, but as you can see, again, this is going to show you the progress in real time. Let's go ahead and click through and see the console, since this is where the interesting information is. So just like any other Jenkins job, right now I'm not actually logged in. I didn't set up security, so it's telling us that this particular user, Anonymous, has kicked off this workflow job. If something else triggered it, like a new image push to Docker Hub, or for example, you'll see that as being the trigger that starts this entire console output. And then here, the workflow is just telling you what's going on. So here, we're starting to run on the master per my instructions, and we've created a workspace called Workspace 2. And then we're entering our first stage, our first of 3 stages called Build. And here, it's just letting you know, here are the Docker commands that we're running to get that workspace, the Jenkins slave that I defined up and running. And here we're running these steps that you defined in your workflow inside of a Docker container. So as you'll recall, we're doing a checkout from Git. We're pulling Uday's Git repository Docker Jenkins demo app. There haven't really been any changes since the last time we pulled it. And so now let's run the Maven build. So just like usual, Maven downloads the entire internet. It was successful. Now we're going to archive the artifact that we created, which if you'll recall was a war file. So once we've archived that, we finished our first stage. We finished, running inside of the Docker container. So now it's time to set up our connection to the Docker registry. Again, in my example, I'm using Docker Hub. That's where I'm going to push my company's gold-tested Docker image. But of course, Docker Hub offers an on-premise version called Docker Hub Enterprise. So you could always specify there instead where that particular private image registry is. So again, we're connecting to Docker Hub with our credentials. We are successful, and now we're entering the the second stage called package. So now we're packaging up our application. We're putting the war file into the container. We're running Docker build to do this, and we're building an image called, again, this is my username on Docker Hub, Lavalier, and then this is the name of the image that we're creating, the image that will have our war file packaged into a Tomcat container, so Acme Core-app. So again, creating that build, setting the build context. In this case, we're basing this all off of a Docker Acme Core base that Uday created. So we've got Uday's name here. We're copying the war file in. There's an intermediate container that has to be created. Let's scroll down a little bit more. And now we're actually doing the push. We're tagging it with the demo tag that we specified earlier, and now we're pushing it to Docker Hub. And this is just the API endpoint to do that, index.docker.io. And again, no changes, so image already exists. And then this ran a little test, that part of the deployment script. It deployed the application, as you can see here, and then it ran a test to see what was the response. Did the application actually go out correctly? Here you can see there's expected response, and the received response was hello y'all. And so if we go again to port 9999 on this particular instance, here we see hello y'all. So it was deployed successfully, and that's the end of our workflow. So that was just a really basic workflow. Again, it was quite linear. In the future, if there's interest, we'd be more than happy to demo a more complex workflow with different types of logic, or maybe deployments that are more rolling in nature rather than a local deployment of a very silly little war file. But that was the demo for today. Again, any questions, please post them in the chat window.
So Tracy, the good news and bad news is we have a ton of questions, probably way more than we're going to have time to for today. What I'm going to ask our engineers on the back end to do is to make sure we have a copy of all these questions. Whichever questions we do not get to, we will, in written form, submit to Tracy and her team, and we will post written answers to the questions if possible on our DevOps.com page for this webinar.
Okay.
So we'll try to get to as many. Yeah, we'll try to get to as many as we can. But as I said, there's quite a number here, so we'll do our best. Also, Tracy, I wanted to introduce. We have another person.
Yes. Give me one second. I'll pull up his slide. Here we go. Here he is.
There we go. So in addition to Tracy, we're happy to have Uday Arkodi, Director of Solution Architecture for CloudBees, with us as well. Uday, can you hear us?
Hello. Yes. Can you hear me, guys?
Yes. Hear you fine. Okay. We're going to try to get through these questions as quickly as we can, guys, because as I said, we have quite a bit. First question. Does Groovy script is Groovy script automatically generated, or do we need to code in Groovy?
So I can take that question. So the Groovy script, if I'm guessing this is in reference to the workflow. I think Tracy showed you how the DSL can be built using that sample sandbox that's available in every workflow job. So there is some help in understanding the DSL that is specific to workflow. If you're designing simple workflows that should be sufficient for you guys. But if you want to add more complex logic, if you're a Groovy expert, you can create really complex Groovy scripts, and that would need some understanding of Groovy. But if you're kicking the tires and doing some basic stuff, then the utility there should help. Now, one thing I'll also say is the whole purpose of workflow is to create reusable logic. Every workflow will certainly have some components that can be used perhaps in another workflow. And Jenkins has a way for you to create libraries of these Groovy scripts that can be reused across multiple workflows. So, typically what we see is in a team, there are a couple of Groovy experts who will help create these libraries, and the rest of the developers will kind of reuse those libraries within their workflow.
Excellent. Next, someone wanted to know what exactly is the Artifactory?
Artifactory is a binary repository. I'm not sure if we referenced Artifactory, but if that's what they're referring to, then it is a binary repository that you can push your artifacts from a build, like your jar files and your war files.
Got it. Next, is it possible to restart some failed point in the middle of the build without restarting the build from the beginning?
Yes, there is a feature of CloudBees Jenkins Platform that is called checkpoints that's built on top of Jenkins workflow that actually lets you establish predetermined checkpoints, and if a job fails after the checkpoint, you can go back to the checkpoint and continue from there. The point there is that you can actually save time. If you spend 6 hours doing integration tests, and after the checkpoint, if the build failed not because the code was bad, but maybe because the dependency was not ready, then you could always go back and run from the checkpoint, and that saves you a lot of time.
So Uday, to be clear, is that a feature in open source Jenkins, or is that a CloudBees Enterprise Jenkins feature?
That is a CloudBees Enterprise feature.
Got it. Okay. Next, the person wanted to know, does the Docker integration work with Jenkins open source, or is it, again, only CloudBees?
Good question. All the Docker plugins that we have showcased are part of the open source community. All of the pieces are out there. These were plugins created by CloudBees, but were completely open source. So you can run the entire demo that Tracy just showed using open source bits, with the exception of the UI, the visualization and checkpoints.
Got it. Next, can you use Dockerfile to build the images with Jenkins?
Yes. In the repository that Tracy showed, there was a Dockerfile. In your job, you can actually, there is a build and push plugin, Docker build and push plugin that actually lets you build from a Docker file, an image, and push it to the Docker Hub registry.
Excellent. How is Docker infrastructure linked to the Flow plugin, the one with the different phases, or are they two independent things?
They are not independent. The workflow provides specific DSL to consume the plugin capabilities within a workflow. So they are integrated. You get more power when you use the Docker functionality within the context of a workflow. So you can do more complex things, not just linear, do this, do this, do this. You can also establish parallel steps. You can do if-then logic. You can, pretty much create a kind of a state machine, if you will, if you have a very complex build. But, they are nicely integrated in that workflow.
Excellent. Next, is the build done by Jenkins or by Dockerfile build?
Dockerfile gives us the environment that we need to run the build. typically developers have a set of tools they use to build, test their application. Docker container kind of gives us that environment. In the world where there is no Docker container, this would have been provided by a VM or a physical machine. Now, the amount of resources that you use when you do that is either the entire VM or the entire hardware. But in the Docker, you can actually run multiple of these containers. So the benefit of Docker is that you can run a lot of these on a single host. But essentially, it is simulating that desktop or that VM that developers need with their tools on it. But the build is actually run by Jenkins on that Docker slave.
Got it. Is there a reference document that contains the entire API for the DSL?
Yes, there should be plenty of documentation, and if there are gaps, we would love to know about them. But I think it is well documented. Jesse and team did an amazing job putting together documentation and tutorials for the workflow.
Excellent. Our next question: how Docker integrates with 3 different operating systems? Well, I guess maybe how does Docker? For Linux, no problem, but what if I need to build under Windows or Mac OS X?
Great question that comes up quite often. As I understand at the moment, typically it's the Linux-based workloads that you can run on Docker containers. Windows, as I understand, will come out with the support sometime soon. Mac, I don't know if there is anything at the moment.
Got it. This question, someone wants to know if we will have some practice samples in the webinar, but we've already had the webinar, so I guess that question's answered. So someone wanted to be able to take a look at the script for the workflow. I don't know if we can make that available or not.
It's already available on the GitHub. I think this session will be recorded. If you replay it, you should be able to find it. Otherwise, we'll try and post those links on a post blog if you're posting some Q&A there.
Great. Next question was, will this work with a private registry?
Yes, the APIs, as long as the APIs are consistent with the Docker Hub APIs, the answer is yes.
Fantastic. Let's see, can we look at the script? Can we use a different registry? How does the pipeline deal with environment-specific configuration differences that an app needs? For example, different URLs for services that the app connects to in dev, QA, and production.
You can, within a context of a workflow, you can actually manipulate your environment variables. You can also use additional plugins like env inject and that kind of stuff to inject your variables into your workflow. I'm sure there are some best practices out there that every team would want to use, but there are multiple ways of doing this. I don't know if I can go into all of those. Perhaps that in itself is a separate blog, but yes, there are ways to inject. So I'm guessing that the thought here is you have a dev environment, you're running the workflow, and then you promote the workflow to QA, the environment variables might change, and you can accommodate all of those use cases in workflow. Got
it. Apart from monitoring Docker Hub, can you monitor custom Docker registry?
I don't know what is the meaning of a custom Docker registry.
I think there are kind of third-party registries that, and I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth, but there are third-party registries that companies are coming out with that are doing things, let's say at least different, if not better, than Docker Hub's registry, right? You can have private registries that aren't in the cloud and maybe more secure, etc.
Got it. Yeah. As far as I know, the notification mechanism, the webhook, is only built into Docker Hub. Now, that's not to say the other registries can't do that, but as far as I know, that's the only registry that has the webhook capability.
Uday,
Got
I
it.
think Google Container Registry just added support for it recently, because
Uh,
I did the post on it. So yeah, that's another option, at least one that we've tested and we know works.
That's
right.
Google Container Registry. Would that be part of Kubernetes?
It's part of the Google Cloud platform, which is
Got it.
underpinned by Kubernetes. So yeah.
Excellent. Next question is, do you support headless browser testing capability out of box?
That's a good question. I would imagine, yes, if you can run it in a VM, you can run it in a container. But I haven't played with it, so I'm not 100% sure. Maybe something that we can follow up.
Okay, next question is, where can I get the snippet generator plugin?
It's built into the workflow. Every time you create a workflow, you should be able to go down into the job and see a snippet generator there.
Okay. I lost my place there for a second. Okay, is the Jenkins server running a Docker container? Is this Jenkins server running a Docker container?
Is this Jenkins? That would be a Tracy question. I don't know how she set up the demo.
Yeah. For the first step, where we checked out the code from GitHub, that was running in a Docker container. Shoot, what was it called? Acme Core-build environment Docker image container, which is publicly available on the Docker Hub registry.
Okay. Our next question is, what plugin is used for workflow app? Is that plugin specific to CloudBees?
No, it's an open source workflow plugin. Is the open source plugin. It's available to everybody to use. The only two features that are CloudBees specific are the visualization and checkpoints.
Got it. Let's see. Stage part. How far goes image? I can say I'm not sure about that question. Someone Jacob Malikowicz. I didn't understand your question. If you could kind of resubmit, we'll try to get to it. What kind of constraints can be added to the workflow between package and deploy? We would want to implement an approval method for our product environment before packages are deployed.
Excellent question. One of the steps you can add in a workflow call is called an input step, and that's mainly for accommodating manual use cases where you have to do something manual. Manual could be an approval process as well. The input step takes an attribute to provide a role of an individual who can approve that step. There are quite a few blogs around the use case. If you go to my blog, there are a couple of things there that I described on how to implement that. But it's well documented. There are APIs to do that. If you want to integrate with an external system for approval, you can do that as well. But the way you would do that is through that input step.
Excellent. CloudBees Jenkins is an extension to standard Jenkins platform and providing integration with other tools.
Sorry, Alan, I
Pictures
missed the first part. Can you repeat the question?
I'd like to, but it looked like I think our engineers has already marked it answered and it disappeared. I think the gist of it is CloudBees Jenkins an extension to open source Jenkins in terms of the integration with tools?
Oh, yeah. So CloudBees Jenkins platform is built on top of the open source Jenkins. It's built on the LTS branch. All the functionality is built on top of that as additional plugins. So, you know, if the question is mainly because you want to move from open source Jenkins to CloudBees, that is quite seamless because the platform is based on the open source LTS branch.
Got it. Next question. Tracy, do you recommend, he liked your demo, do you recommend, like in the demo, to get a base Docker image, then check out your source code, rather than get a Docker image with your source code already baked in?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I think they're saying, do you in the demo, do you get your Docker image without the source code already in it and then put it in, or is the Docker image already have source code within the container?
Okay, so we're we're not putting the source code in the container. So there's two different containers that we were showing today. One was the Docker slave, and that was where we were creating a Jenkins slave workspace and checking the code into the slave's workspace. But it wasn't like there's no, as far as I know, there's no way to like just ship out a container and have it. Well, I guess you could write a step that would automatically check it out, code out of GitHub every time, but I don't know why you would do that. Maybe there's some advantage I'm not aware of. This is all very early days, so as far as best practices with this specifically, I'm not 100% sure what would be best. But when it comes to the slave image, the slave image, I don't think it really makes sense to check out automatically out of GitHub every time you build that image or anything like that. When it comes to the actual like app image, it wasn't. I mean, we were packaging up the WAR file into that particular image, and that was part of the process. So I'm not really sure there's what the ask was there. I mean, you wouldn't put raw source code into your image there, your company's app image. You know what I mean? Maybe that I'm not phrase it very well. I guess I'm just a little confused about what the ask is. I assume that you're asking about the slave image.
Yeah. So I think I might have a take on this as well. So I think Tracy's right. So you don't necessarily have to have your source code before you run the build on the Docker image. Like Tracy mentioned, there are two images there. One that acts as the environment for the build itself, where you're running the job. But there was another container that was built as part of the build itself, where we are packaging the application within a Docker image and pushing that image to the Docker registry. Usually code is not built into the Docker image. Your code is changing regularly. So you check out the code in a container, run the build, maybe build another Docker image, or just build the binary artifact, and that's it. You don't need to have the code inside a container.
Got it. Hey guys, we're already past the top of the hour, and we do have quite a bit of questions left. So I'm going to ask our engineers to grab these questions. Tracy and Uday, we will get you the questions written, and perhaps when you have some time, you can give us some responses that we can post. But otherwise, we'll be here all day, and it's not fair. I know everyone is busy and has other things to do. As much as we'd like here to just stay and talk Docker and Jenkins. With that being said, though, Tracy and Uday, thank you so much for being our guest here today, and thank CloudBees for sponsoring today's webinar. This is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of DevOps.com. Most of all, thank the 600 or so people who logged on today to listen in on what I think was a great webinar. We do a regular series of webinars, including ones on Jenkins and CloudBees and topics like Docker. You, of course, can read more at DevOps.com and our new sister site that is dedicated to Docker, containers, Kubernetes, called Container Journal, and it's at containerjournal.com. With that said, this is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, and thank you very much for listening on today's webinar.